Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Anna Lembke to discuss addiction. Anna is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. As a clinician scholar, she has published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, and commentaries. She sits on the board of several state and national addiction-focused organizations and has testified before various committees in the United States House of Representatives and Senate. In 2016, Anna published Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop, which was highlighted in the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to read to understand the opioid epidemic. She recently appeared on the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, which addresses the impact social media has on our lives. Her newest book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, explores how to moderate compulsive overconsumption in a dopamine-overloaded world, and was the topic of our conversation. I think the most important takeaway I had from my conversation with Anna was my newfound lens for viewing the pleasurable activities that I pursue in my daily life. While things like tasty meals, a few cocktails, or simply getting lost in your phone in the evening seem like elements of a happy life, these types of activities carry a cost. Our brains are not designed to handle many of the modern ways we seek pleasure. They are overstimulating, and by relying on them as tools to feel good, we are raising our pleasure threshold so high that when we aren't engaging in these activities, we feel a sense of emptiness. Only through aggressive boundaries can we maintain a stable baseline level of happiness and avoid becoming slaves to desire. Another critical point I realized from our conversation is the importance of coupling effort with reward. The on-demand nature of modern pleasures is a major contributor to the negative outcomes we experience. We must figure out ways to add space between our desire and the reward we are seeking in order for the rewards to have sustainable benefits. Suppose you love pancakes, and I gave you a button that made a plate of pancakes magically appear in your lap. You might think that this would be pretty amazing, but everything we've learned about the brain tells us that this would very quickly diminish the pleasurable feeling you get out of eating pancakes. And for more addictive substances like nicotine, you may not grow tired of your consumption, but you'll eventually come to find yourself not motivated by pleasure or liking, but by wanting to just feel normal. I strongly believe that this episode contains some of the most important and practical advice related to long-term happiness and well-being. Since reading Anna's book and chatting with her, I have completely changed how I make decisions regarding pleasure and pain. And I hope that you feel as inspired as I was after hearing her perspectives. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Anna Lembke. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
So your book really stuck with me, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I picked it up earlier this year and fell in love immediately. It's easily my favorite book of the year.
Oh, thank you.
And while the book is about addiction, it also provides a framework, not for just understanding addiction, but for understanding what people do when they want to feel good in the most broad of sense. And it looks at behaviors that go beyond substance use, like our relationship with technology. Even hobbies can be reframed in the context of the focus of your book, which is dopamine. So what is the function of dopamine, and why is it so important for understanding addiction?
Dopamine has many different functions. It's a chemical that we make in our brain that is essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It is not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. It's the chemical that says you need to pay attention to what's happening right now and potentially do it again. And therefore, dopamine is fundamental to our survival, because if we did not have this kind of reflexive, ancient, highly conserved wiring that says approach this and avoid that, we would not have survived over millions of years of evolution, especially in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that we've lived in for most of human existence. So dopamine plays this very fundamental role that says, pay attention to this. It's important for your survival. Investigate, explore, and probably do it again.
Now, what seems to be part of the issue with dopamine and how it can contribute to, let's just say, harmful outcomes in the modern world, a lot of that deals with how the dopamine levels in our brain, how it sort of cycles. So you talk about in the book, there's this constant sort of balance between pleasure and pain. Could you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Sure. I mean, I think to contextualize it a little bit, we have evolved for an environment where we would have to work very hard up front, as in, for example, walk tens of kilometers every day to find a little bit of food, clothing, shelter, a mate that would then release a little bit of dopamine, essentially to bring our pleasure-pain balance back to baseline, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. So, what one of the interesting findings in neuroscience is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. The same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. They work like opposite sides of a balance, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. Certain rules govern this balance, and one of the first and most important rules is that the balance wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, so that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. So again, thinking about us as humans with this kind of wiring in an environment that's harsh, in an environment where resources are scarce, in an environment where we have to endure a lot of pain, as in that balance gets tilted to the side of pain, for example, because we're very hungry and we're looking for food. When we find that berry bush, or we kill an animal and eat it, or what have you, that's going to release dopamine, making us feel good, and that's going to restore our balance back to the baseline position, right? Which is great. What happens in the modern world, however, is that assuming that we're at the baseline position, or even not at the baseline position, even tilted to slightly to the side of pain for whatever reason, we are now surrounded with so many highly reinforcing substances and behaviors that release so much dopamine all at once in our reward pathway that essentially our pleasure-pain balance is struggling to compensate. So, for example, just take our food supply, right? Lots of fat, sugar, and salt, additives, flavorants. Food is no longer just for nourishment. Food has become a drug. When we ingest these highly caloric, rich, flavorful foods, that releases a lot of dopamine all at once in the reward pathway, and that pleasure-pain balance tilts to the side of pleasure. Now, remember, No sooner has that happened than our brains are going to work hard to restore a level balance. But how do they do it? They do it first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That process is called neuroadaptation. And I like to think of that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. In this case, they stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That is the come down, the hangover, the after effect, that state of craving that has us wanting to eat one more cookie, one more piece of chocolate, whatever it is. And if in that state of craving, we have easy access to more of whatever it is, we are very much driven to reach for that as a way to quickly restore ourselves back to the level position. Now, if we don't do that, right, and if we restrain ourselves, which is hard to do, eventually those gremlins on the pain side of the balance get the memo that there's no more of this reward forthcoming. They hop off, and a level balance or homeostasis is restored. But the fundamental point here is that for every really intense pleasure that we experience from a baseline position, we pay a price, and that price is pain. That is the come down, and more importantly, that state of craving that can then put us into this addiction vortex that has us repeatedly reaching for more.
So, can you help put into context the types of things in our modern world that will spike our dopamine in sort of an unhealthy way? You mentioned a couple. You mentioned sort of like the cookie or the dense caloric food. Right. It does intuitively make sense that our environment today is fundamentally different from that in which our brain evolved. That's one of the themes on this podcast. I've talked to Doug Kenrick a little bit about how evolution has created some of our hardwired motives. But could you put into context, what are the big culprits of the modern world? Because in your book title, you call it the Age of Indulgence. What are the big culprits in the modern world that are going to influence our dopamine in unhealthy ways?
Well, there are traditional drugs, cannabis, alcohol, cocaine, opioids. The list is endless. Of note, though, even those ancient drugs that have been around for millennia are more potent, more abundant, more novel, and more accessible than ever before. And access is a huge risk factor for addiction. So if you live in a place where a drug is easily accessible, you're more likely to try it, more likely to get addicted to it. But on top of that, and in addition to food, as already mentioned, there are all kinds of behaviors that have become drugified in some way. And technology and science and innovation, and especially the internet and digital media, have really exploded the phenomenon of behavioral or process addictions. And this is things like gambling, gaming, sex addiction involving pornography and compulsive masturbation, etc. This is things like shopping. This is things like human connection through, all kinds of social media, which have essentially drugified human connection. Even things that we typically think of as, healthy and adaptive, like reading, for example, or playing chess, or exercise, or work. These things have become drugified too by, again, making them more reinforcing, by linking them to either social regard or monetary benefits, more accessible, more bountiful in that there's no stopping point. We can 24/7 access these kinds of behaviors, made them more novel, right? By combining multiple drugs together, a game plus music, plus social media, plus exercise, which is how you overcome tolerance and make a drug more potent. When you think about something like exercise, which typically, is immediately toxic to cells, aversive, hard to get ourselves to do. We even managed to drugify exercise through all of the machines that we've created, the quantification, where we're now tracking numbers. Dopamine seems highly sensitive to numbers. making it, an outlet for social media and social connection through various apps that allow us to post our times, compare ourselves to others. So you have this really interesting phenomenon where almost everything, it seems to me, has been drugified in some way, making our environment very addictogenic, such that all of us have become vulnerable to the problem of compulsive overconsumption in the modern age.
So I want to talk a little bit more about this sort of drugification, as you call it. Could you dive in a little bit deeper as to the characteristics of these types of behaviors and what is specifically unique about today? That what are the properties, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, that might take a behavior and switch it from something that you like to do occasionally to something that has momentum that you can't stop.
Yeah, so let's take human connection as an example. We are social creatures. We live in tribes. We've evolved over millions of years to make human connections as necessary to survival. Being part of a tribe allows us to steward scarce resources, protect ourselves from enemies, and find mates, all of which we need to do to survive. What's happened in the modern era with the internet, technology, social media, is that we've taken human connection, which we know releases dopamine in the reward pathway mediated by our love hormone oxytocin, at least, probably mediated in very many other ways as well. Serotonin certainly plays a role there as well. And we've essentially turned that phenomenon of making a connection to another human being into a drug through social media. What are the characteristics of that? Well, number one, a drug is something that releases a lot of dopamine right away without having to do much upfront work. That is certainly true for making connections to other human beings through social media. We don't even have to get up off the couch, right? So typically, if you wanted to meet somebody, you had to go out of your house and you had to look for the people. And then you had to probably meet a lot of different people before you met somebody that, you liked. And then you had to deal with the parts of that person you didn't like because there weren't a lot of other options, and you had to negotiate things, and there were ups and downs, and you had to stick through them because being together was better than being alone. None of that is true anymore. Now we can sit on our couch, we can swipe right, we can swipe left. The images are, filtered images, ever more beautiful, amazing personalities. People like us back. So there's this exchange of information and pictures and music. So immediately, we've got this incredible reinforcer. We've got like buttons, right? We've got essentially infinite quantity. And for people who are especially, let's say, titillated or turned on or reinforced by connecting with other human beings, this is going to be, a very powerful kind of a drug. Whether it's a dating app or whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or what have you. And then on top of all of that, the innately reinforcing aspects of, the easy access, the almost, infinite amount, like TikTok never runs out, the novelty of it, right? The potency of it through the colors and the lights and the filters. On top of all of that, you have added AI algorithms that essentially learn what we like and then drive us to ever more extreme forms of engagement. So it's not a passive process. Imagine if it's hard to sort of think of an analogy, but imagine if, you liked cannabis and cannabis actually knocked on your door or found you at work or, showed up and jumped out of your computer, while you were trying to get something done. That's essentially what digital drugs do, right? The algorithms learn us. They know what we've liked. We've got these push notifications. We have alerts. They come into our inboxes. They intrude on our visual screen. they're quantified. The quantification makes us track our rankings, our number of likes, and on it goes.
So after reading your book, I started to think a little bit more about how I interact with, these types of things, technology, even substances to a certain degree. And I want to circle back and talk about specifically substances for a moment, which seem to be, even though technology is probably, a lot higher of a percentage of the population probably use technology versus hard drugs or something like that. It seems as though substance use is probably the most serious, or has the most serious consequences of these categories of behaviors. Your book really got me thinking about the distinction between the casual user of a substance and what you might classically call an addict. And I started noticing and thinking about the fact that casual users of, let's just say, alcohol and marijuana, we'll keep it broad. Casual users love to distance themselves from addicts, quote unquote addicts. It's to the point where if you haven't had 16 DUIs, everything's fine. Everything's fine.
Right.
As long as I go to work in the morning, I'm fine. Which is, it's not a good way to conceptualize your relationship with a substance. I think of the comedian Bert Kreischer. He talks on his podcast a lot about his substance use and alcohol, and he romanticizes alcohol to the nth degree. And 2 years ago, I might have been there along with him and saying, cracking open a bottle of wine, there's nothing better. But after going through your book, for better or for worse, I don't see it that way anymore. It seems more like the substance sort of hacking my brain and thinking that that's what pleasure is. Could you talk about some of the justification, some of the thoughts and mechanisms that people use when they think about their substance and how they rationalize their usage?
Sure. Yeah. So the first sort of thing you described is like, I would need 12 DUIs to really consider myself as having a problem, is really classic thinking for somebody who has a problem. And we usually refer to it as normalization of use. And normalization is achieved in large part by affiliating with other people who are using in maladaptive or addictive ways, and then telling ourselves everybody uses that way. So, for example, we might see in our clinic a Stanford student who's consuming, 30 standard drinks in a week, which is well outside what we would consider to be, healthy or moderate, non-risky drinking. And that student will typically say to us, I don't have a problem. Everybody drinks like that. In fact, Joe drinks even more. So I can't possibly have a problem because Joe doesn't have a problem. And then what can help in that instance is that we say, well, did you know that in fact 50% of Americans don't drink at all? And then an additional, let's say, 40% has no more than 1 to 2 standard drinks per week. So that puts you in the, 5 to 1 percentile, or at 30 standard drinks a week, definitely in the 1 percentile. And then that's a surprise to people. That's a surprise because they really have normalized their use in their own minds, in large part by affiliating with other people who use similarly, which is why oftentimes people who use substances in maladaptive ways will put a lot of pressure on other people to use with them. So there's a lot of like, come on, come on, come on. And part of that comes from wanting everybody around them to use to again, normalize their use. So, these kinds of behaviors, they're not largely occurring consciously. They're sort of invisible to us. The other thing that I think is really powerful and worth talking about is this concept of euphoric recall, where if you go back to the pleasure pain balance, we're very We have very vivid recall for the initial stimulus that gives us pleasure, but very poor recall for its downstream effects, as characterized by those neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. In fact, this also happens in the reverse for painful stimuli, right? Like because it turns out if I intentionally press on the pain side of the balance, the gremlins go on the pleasure side and I get my dopamine indirectly. When I wake up in the morning, I have a very vivid memory of exercise being painful. I can't seem to remember that the after effects of my exercising are pleasure. So we just don't remember the downstream effects. And this euphoric recall for our drug of choice persists long after that drug stops doing the thing that we want from it. So long after it stopped working, long after it's caused all kinds of problems, we still remember the drug fondly and we crave it. And when we're under stress, it's the first thing that we think of and that we want to turn to, even when it's not working and causing the opposite effects. So these are, some of the phenomena that we talk a lot about when people are working to get into recovery.
How about this trend that I've seen lately? I mean, I'm not an avid THC user, but now more than ever, I tend to see THC used as self-medicating anxiety, or just other types of symptoms that are sort of in that area, maybe as far as depression. But the sentiment is always, well, this helps me cope, so there's no downside to that, right? It helps me cope. And do you feel that there are some cases where where substances like THC can be helpful, or do you kind of fall back on, well, there's no such thing as a free thing in nature?
Yeah, I would say a little bit of both. So I always validate that the initial using of any substance, including cannabis, in order to alleviate some kind of suffering, whether it's physical pain or mental pain, is effective for some individuals, which is why they go back to it and they do it again. So I always start by validating something like, I hear you that when you first started using cannabis, it helped you sleep, or it alleviated your anxiety, or it made you less depressed, or it made you feel more creative, or made you less socially phobic, or it helped with your physical pain. All of that is valid in the short term for a given individual. But again, if we go back to that pleasure-pain balance and those gremlins, the second rule of the balance is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar reinforcing stimulus, no matter what our reason is for using it, that initial deviation to the pleasure side gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. In other words, those gremlins start to multiply. And with repeated use over time, we end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And then we're entering addicted brain, where we've essentially changed our hedonic or joy set point such that we need more of a drug over time to get the same effect. It stops working at a given dose. And when we're not using, those gremlins are slamming our balance to the side of pain, and we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. So when patients say to me, cannabis is the only thing that works for my anxiety, for example, I say, yes, I believe that at this point you are getting relief from your anxiety. But my hypothesis is that you're not actually treating the underlying anxiety disorder. All you're doing is medicating withdrawal from the last dose. And that in fact, it is your continued use of cannabis that's causing your anxiety to get worse over time, i.e. that's causing those gremlins to multiply and change your hedonic set point, such that really the better intervention for your anxiety is for you to abstain from cannabis for long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins that have accumulated on the pain side of the balance to actually hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. which is hard to do because when you stop using cannabis, you're going to slam to the side of pain, and that's going to last for at least 10 to 14 days. You're going to be in a state of withdrawal. I just had a patient today who said to me, "Oh, I don't have cannabis withdrawal." So he uses cannabis most days of the week to treat his pain. And I said, "Okay." He said, "Yeah, I don't have cannabis withdrawal. It helps my pain and it helps me sleep." I said, "Okay, well, when you don't use it at night, how's your sleep?" He said, "Well, it's usually not very good." I said, "Okay, well, could you conceive that your inability to sleep, if you don't use cannabis, is a form of your withdrawal from cannabis?" He's able to concede that that may be the case. So, it's very tricky because the narrative that we create, especially around medicinal use and self-medication, can start out to be true, but eventually end up to be not only not true, but the opposite of true. And it's really then only with a period of abstinence and resetting reward pathways, that we can begin to get clarity on that, not when we're in it and kind of chasing those feelings. I will also add, with particular pertinence to cannabis, that we now have some data that's very useful that's coming out showing that in people who are daily users of cannabis, by either eliminating the number of days per week that they use cannabis or the overall amounts of cannabis they're using on any given day, they experience improvements in anxiety, depression, and overall well-being. So it's very nice to have that data point, because what you have is a lot of misleading messaging out there saying that cannabis is an effective treatment for mental health conditions. And in fact, there's no reliable evidence that over the long term, or even short term, frankly, cannabis is effective medicine for any mental health condition. So let's just pause there for a moment, because despite the media hype, there's no reliable evidence that cannabis is effective for any psychiatric disorder. It's got short-term efficacy for pain, for spasticity, for chemotherapy-related anorexia. It doesn't work for mental health disorders, and in fact, makes mental health worse.
Yeah. I used to think of there was some overlap between drug use or casual drug use and superstition. When I was in grad school, I did some work on superstition, and there's some data suggesting it might help with performance. And I always ask the question, it's like, well, yeah, but what happens when you take away the superstition, or what happens when you take away the lucky object? Like, I'm more interested in that rather than chasing the having that with you all the time. There's, aside from that, there's a resource thing too. It's like, are you spending money and energy on this mechanism when you could be using it somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's all going to be the cost benefit analysis, right? And I think the key piece there is that when we are chasing dopamine, we are not necessarily the best judges of that. And that's something that's hard to accept, but just so repeatedly true, that I think we have to really look outside of ourselves and look to what others are saying. Because when we rely on our own judgment, we will repeatedly misperceive reality in favor of our drug of choice and not appreciate the real impact and the real causal direction. But if we ask other people around us what they're observing, we're likely to get much more reliable data.
Another interesting defense that I commonly hear when it comes to things like substances, and I would say this definitely kind of bleeds into food, which is, it seems on the surface like a philosophical argument. Like, it goes something like, I prefer to have the experiences that are 8s and 9s on a regular basis. So if it's, a substance like alcohol, I want to drink and have a blast half the week, and then I'll deal with the hangovers, the 2s and the 3s. You see it with food. I just, I want the cake. I want the ice cream. I like the sweets. They make me happy. And the argument is that is the way that I operate. That is what happiness means to me. On the other side of the coin, you can kind of dismiss the, who wants to live a 5 or a 6 every day, right? And I'm almost convinced by that, but I'm curious as to, because I can see the sentiment there, but I'm curious as to your thoughts about moderation and this idea of, it kind of goes back to the romanticizing drug use. But could you talk a little bit about moderation and this sort of dynamic of being okay with 5s and 6s versus, peak experiences?
Yeah, this comes up a lot in clinical care as people get into recovery from addiction. One of the main complaints and often one of the main reasons for relapse is boredom. Sort of like, this is not very interesting, not just minus drug use, but minus all the drama that my drug use created. Do I really want to live in this world of sort of pale shades of gray? But the truth of the matter is that with sustained recovery, as we immerse ourselves in reality such as it is, the world becomes very interesting and very bright and very engaging in ways that are ultimately, I would argue, more rewarding and more sustainable. And I think a lot of what drives this sort of like, well, yeah, I'm going to, have to pay a price, but you only live once, carpe diem, I want the excitement. I'm a risk taker, blah, blah, blah. That's partially driven by, I think, our cultural tropes, and the way that we conceptualize what is happiness and what is being alive and what is the purpose of my life and all these things. And unfortunately, we live in a culture with quite a nihilistic orientation around the idea that, like, life doesn't really have all that much meaning. So why not just live on the extremes, and then, burn bright and burn fast, and then burn out. And, and that's sad. But instead of just sort of, I think, committing ourselves to that, what I think is, ultimately an unhealthy narrative, what we need to do is really immerse ourselves in finding meaning and purpose, which is hard to do, in a world in which that's not obvious, a world in which basic survival needs are essentially taken care of, and we have to get a lot more creative.
Well, and the other part of it, specifically as it relates to food, for example, if you are making it a norm to eat the high fat, high salt, high sugar types of foods, what you generally find at a fast food place, or even going out to eat is loaded with, these ingredients that make us crave, these types of dishes again. The regular everyday types of food become bland.
Right.
It's not as if they're inherently
right.
Inherently bland.
Right.
It is only by contrast. And I realized this very quickly, having been sort of on a ketogenic diet for most of 2023, that when I'm eating my can of tuna and some avocado and stuff that is kind of boring, that it's very rewarding, except for when I've had maybe a weekend where I've gone out and had a big meal. And you actually I can actually catch myself wanting something more, something tastier, as I'm coming down on that Monday after the weekend.
Yeah, there's that old joke. It's like, what's the secret ingredients to any recipe? And the answer is hunger. And when we are genuinely hungry, even a piece of broccoli tastes good, genuinely good. So yeah, recognizing the relative nature of pleasure and pain is essentially at the heart of this neuroscience metaphor of pleasure and pain balance. And I think that, as we try to recapture pleasure in our lives, instead of relentlessly pursuing ever more potent forms, what we need to recognize is that our desire is infinite, and that never ends, and that the more potent the pleasure, the bigger the come down. And finally, we get to a place where we can't find anything that works anymore. And again, we're sort of been in this kind of chronic dopamine deficit state as a way to compensate for all of these dopamine hits. And instead, to recapture pleasure, we have to pursue a kind of new form of asceticism where we really abstain from and, deny ourselves these highly reinforcing, drugified forms of food or whatever it is, so that life's everyday, more modest pleasures become pleasurable again. And they do. And so, I think one of the ways to help ourselves kind of reset things is also to reframe the way that we think about it, instead of thinking about it as, again, denial or not being able to have something. If instead we reframe it as giving ourselves the great gift of recapturing our ability to take joy in more modest pleasures, so that we're moving towards something positive, not just denying ourselves, these kinds of high rewards that are constantly tempting
us. So let's talk about you just kind of mentioned some good advice about how we frame pleasure. Let's talk about some concrete solutions to addressing this problem of dopamine. So obviously, one of those is, as you sort of mentioned, is reframing pleasure and sort of taking the initiative to avoid some of these activities that spike our dopamine levels too high, and that can help us enjoy the things that are sort of in the middle. What is another thing that we can do to avoid some of these pitfalls of highly pleasurable or the pursuit of pleasure?
So another thing that's really important is to recognize that our pleasure-pain balance is triggered not just by the drug itself, but also by reminders of the drug, people, places, and things that we associate with our drug of choice. And because, once we're triggered and experience craving, it's very hard to resist. One of the things we can do is create self-binding strategies to limit not just our exposure to our drug of choice, whatever it may be, but also to triggers of that drug of choice. So, as you know, in the book, I talk about my addiction to romance novels. And, one of the big triggers for me was the medium of reading them on a Kindle, which allowed me to access Amazon as soon as I finished one, read another one right away, even if it was 3 a.m. and I should be going to sleep. So for me, an important self-binding strategy was actually to get rid of the Kindle and to make it necessary for me to go to the library and get a book if I wanted to get one. And just that little pause and that delay can really help us recapture our ability to think through whether or not we really want to consume that particular item. So I think these kinds of self-binding strategies, which come in many different flavors. Sometimes it might be not having a particular food in the house, or not having a particular app on our phone, or, locking away our devices at a certain time of day. All kinds of microenvironmental changes that we can make that make it more likely for us to be able to stay, within our consumptive goals, whatever those may be.
What are some mistakes, some typical mistakes that individuals make when they address their own addiction? I feel like there's got to be some common ones, like sort of, just from your experience dealing with so many different patients. What, are there some commonalities in terms of the strategies that people use?
Definitely. I mean, I wouldn't call any of them mistakes. I would call it all kind of like data gathering, to see sort of what works for a given individual and what doesn't. So, what we typically will do is we will ask people to abstain from their drug of choice for 4 weeks as an opportunity to reset reward pathways. So if they're, struggling with alcohol, that would be no alcohol for 4 weeks. It's cannabis, no cannabis, 4 weeks. This obviously all assumes that they're not at risk for a life-threatening withdrawal. If it's a sex addiction, it would be no orgasm with themselves or others for 4 weeks. If it's romance novels, no romance novels for 4 weeks, what have you. And then at the end of that period, we ask them, well, do you feel better? If they do feel better, and about 80% of them do with that intervention alone, we ask, do you want to go back to using or do you want to abstain, continue to abstain? And most people, the first time around, want to go back to using, but they want to use differently. They typically want to use less, and they want to have more control and agency around their consumption. So then what we do is make a very detailed plan about what that will look like, how much, how often, in what context, with whom, what delivery mechanism, as much detail as we can garner, as well as a plan for accountability. And then they go out into the world and they give it a try. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. And when it doesn't work out in a number of different ways. First of all, there can be something called abstinence violation, where with the plan to moderate is immediately sunk with a massive binge that ends up right where they left off. And then there's this realization like, oh wow, I thought I would be able to moderate. I thought that this month of abstinence, resetting reward pathways, greater insight, greater motivation, but it didn't work out for me, right? I clearly am not able to moderate. And so then the plan is, okay, weren't able to moderate. Maybe we could use some other self-binding strategies that would enable you to moderate. Or maybe you're just a person who's not going to be able to moderate their use of that drug. And that may take many cycles and iterations for the person to realize that. Or maybe the person is actually able to moderate, but it's not worth it in the end, because using in moderation doesn't actually get them the effect that they want. And it's so exhausting that abstinence seems like a better goal. Or maybe moderation works for them and it's worth it. And they're able to continue and maintain that. So all of this is sort of, experimentation, data seek. There's not like, one right way. And I would say the paths are as infinite as there are people. But in general, the kinds of strategies that really help are, as I've said, these self-binding strategies, making sure that that we're insulated not just from the drug, but from triggers as well. The other really useful thing tends to be radical honesty, or embracing an ethos of being totally truthful, because people in their addiction can get into the lying habit. Mm-hmm. And people who are able to moderate or abstain for the long haul usually can't lie or don't lie, and they find that telling the truth helps them. And then also this idea of hormesis, or intentionally doing things that are hard or painful, as a way to upregulate dopamine production indirectly by paying for it up front, which also then, reduces this whole problem of boredom. Because if you're doing things that are really hard as a way to get your dopamine, it's pretty interesting, right? It's not boring, although it is hard.
So that brings me to my last question, which is something that was brought up by my students today in my lecture, where I touched on dopamine, which is, what are some specific activities that people can do to either increase their dopamine, or an activity that is beneficial, that may be unrelated to dopamine, but it's what are the maintenance behaviors that people can do to keep their dopamine system functioning in a healthy way?
So the key here is to, in general, avoid potent intoxicants. And if you do choose to use them in moderation and leave enough time in between use to reset reward pathways to homeostatic baseline so you don't get caught in that vortex of fighting with your gremlin. So that's number one. Number two, we have loads of evidence that exercise upregulates endogenous dopamine and other feel-good neurotransmitters, and some evidence that ice-cold water bath immersion does the same. We also have evidence that meditation and prayer upregulate dopamine levels. So those are examples right there. 4 examples: exercise, ice-cold water baths, meditation and prayer that we have evidence for in terms of upregulating dopamine transmission. But clinically, anecdotally, my patients will tell me that really almost anything that requires effortful engagement over time that is not immediately reinforcing, but the cumulative effect over time brings reward, is very effective. And this would also include social human connection. So addiction leads to isolation. So in many instances, the antidote is to reach out to other humans, maybe not through the technology, right? Or if it's through the technology, not in a way that drugifies the experience. So not on, a dating app, but as a way to maybe augment existing connection with somebody in real life. But maybe in real life, reaching out and making those human social connections. There are lots of things we can do. Effortful engagement in the here and now, making contact with our true selves, other people, and the world around us.
Well, thank you so much. Again, the book is called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It totally reframed the way I look at this idea of pleasure and how we go about finding things that make us feel good. I listened to your interview with Andrew Huberman, and I grabbed one of your quotes, and I paraphrased it, and I've set up my iPhone every day when I prompt it to do my wake up routine. It recites the quote, and the quote is essentially, "Don't do what you want to do what needs to be done," and needs to be done in sort of this kind of romantic way of what inspires you and what speaks to you at a high level. So thank you so much for crafting this book. And thank you for being on today, Anna Lembke.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed our conversation.
For more on Anna, visit annalembke.com. That's ANNALEMBKE.com. Or pick up a copy of Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Don't forget to rate and write a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or X, formerly known as Twitter, at WDWDTpod. As always, feel free to email me with comments or guest suggestions at whydowethatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?